let's take a look now at one of my favorite American composers, Charles Ives. It's not like I listen to Charles Ives all the time, but I think he's just such an interesting character, and his music really reflects his character, and so that's one of the things I think is so fascinating about Ives. So Charles Ives was the son of a Civil War bandmaster. Men went off to war. If they played an instrument, they would often be put into the army band, and they played. Well, after the Civil War, when they came home, a lot of them had really enjoyed that experience, the playing part of it anyway, and they created town bands in their hometowns. And Charles Ives' father was one of those men. So he created a town band in their little town in Massachusetts, and Charles grew up with that environment, with his father working with this group of community bands. And if you've ever heard a community band, you know that they're not always the best players. It's not always the best sound. So Ives grew up with this kind of music, but it wasn't always necessarily like the best performance that you had ever heard, and that's okay. Add to this the fact that Charles's father was just an interesting guy himself. And he was very much interested in sound and acoustics and things you could do with sounds. So he would build instruments. He would just go out to his outbuilding and find something, and he would make an instrument that they would then play it. He would also have his children do these sort of interesting musical experiments at home. So they might sit down at the piano, and Dad would play the accompaniment for some song, and he would make his children sing it in a different key. So we're talking about polytonality here at home. Play it in one key, you guys sing it in another key, or sing it a half step off. So Charles grew up with this sort of odd tonal structure at his house where they were just experimenting with the different sounds. His dad would also take advantage of the fact that he had this town band, and he would do things like, so we've got the town square with our little bandstand in the middle, and he might put the woodwind section over on the courthouse steps, and put the brass section over by the general store, and put the percussion section somewhere else, and have them all play, and he'd stand in the middle, so he got early stereo. Or he might have two bands coming down the street toward each other playing different pieces, and he would stand in the middle just to see what it was going to sound like. So these are the sorts of musical influences that Charles Ives had growing up. His father was just doing some really kind of out there stuff for the late 1800s. So Charles grows up, goes off to college, and he actually studied music and composition at college. But you can imagine, he's grown up with these particular kinds of sounds, and he's writing music and these kinds of sounds. Well, his teachers were like, you're just weird. You need to learn how to do it right. Well, he was doing it right as far as what he was concerned. He was doing what he wanted to do. He's creating the sounds he wanted. So that didn't necessarily pan out to be the best option for him. Well, what he finally ended up doing for a living was becoming an insurance agent. He sold life insurance, and he was fabulously successful at it. He wrote the book, literally, on how to sell life insurance. Made millions. He was rich from doing his life insurance business. So he's rich. He can do whatever kind of compositions he wants now. He's not worried about trying to make a living from his compositions. So much of the music that we have from him shows that influence of his father's odd little experiments on his family when Charles was a child. And he takes those things and he writes music that is just very different. It's not so different that you can't figure out what's going on. In many cases, he would take very familiar things, music that people would know, particularly American kinds of music, because he was a very patriotic man. But he would just do things with them that you would never expect. He would take things like a traditional hymn, like "Shall We Gather at the River." He's got a lovely arrangement of that. And that tune. But he would do weird things with the rhythm. He would put some interesting and odd little harmonies into it. And he was perfectly happy with that. He actually had a church job for a while, but he was having his choir sing these things that were just so weird that that wasn't working out particularly well. But he wrote and he wrote and he wrote music. He wrote lots of it. Unfortunately, he became ill later in life and was not able to keep composing, but we have a lot of music by Charles Ives. He was very generous with his music. He didn't need money from composition. He didn't care about selling his compositions. If you heard something of his somewhere and you liked it, you could just send him a letter and say, Mr. Ives, I really like this piece of music. He would just send you the score. He was generous with it, generous with his music to a fault. But the music that he's left us is just so interesting. One of his very well-known pieces is his Variations on America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, where he basically sort of takes us on a musical journey through the country. It starts out with this nice fanfare that's made up of little fragments of the theme. It has all sorts of weird things like, xylophone parts in there, which is not what you normally think of when you think of an orchestral piece. It has a section that's very straightforward, da 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 da, where it's very, very much like we think it's going to be. He's got a section where I always think of he's sort of traveled to the Southwest when he gets here, where it's like dum 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 dum. It's got all these sort of Spanish rhythms going on. He's got a section in there where he goes into a minor key, and there's a section in there where I imagine that scene where his father's got those two bands coming at each other from opposite directions, where it's just chaos, just this very dissonant and very intense, but you can still recognize that there's America under there somewhere. So that's a piece that people can sort of get if they listen to it, because it's a tune you recognize, and you can just say, oh, hear how he did that with that particular piece of music. He also wrote a lot of, he wrote symphonies, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for one of his symphonies, which means the Pulitzer Prize Committee had good taste, right? They were willing to get what he did. He sent their check back, by the way. He didn't need the money. He just said, yeah, keep the money. I don't need that. But so he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Obviously has respect among other people. He wrote a lot of music based on American themes, so particularly New England, because that's where he was from. The piece that we're going to listen to by Charles Ives is a vocal work called Charlie Rutledge. And Charlie Rutledge is the name of the character in the song, and he's a cowboy. So in this song, he's a cowboy, and he's going to meet a bad end and all sorts of things at the end. So the text itself is interesting, but what's really interesting about this is the things that he asked the singer to do and the way that he treats harmony and melody and rhythm. So when we looked at expressionism, we saw that we had Sprechstimme, where the pitches were not really clearly defined for the singer. Ives does a similar thing in Charlie Rutledge, and you can see the music itself. I've picked a video that's got a scrolling score for you so you can actually see what it looks like. And you can see that there are just sort of suggestions of where a note should be on the staff. So it just tells the singer, you may want to go up or down in pitch here, but other than that, it really doesn't give them much guidance. So it's almost like a lot of those songs you think about from the early musicals where we had actors who couldn't really sing very well, and they would just sort of talk their way through the song. So it has that sort of effect in that section. But that's what Charles Ives wanted him to do. When you get to the end, think about tonality, because when you get to the end, you may wonder if you're at the end. In fact, when I was listening to it just to sort of remind myself of this, I'm thinking, really, does it end there? And I went back and I had to check and make sure. So look at that, how he doesn't go where you think he's going to go tonally, how he uses the voice in a different kind of way, a very modern kind of way. And think about the rhythms, because we're used to vocal works having a certain speech pattern sort of matching the way that we would say these words if we were going to just read the poem. So listen for how he changes those rhythmic patterns to sort of throw you off, and think about whether he might have intended to do that based on what's happening in the text. So this is Charles Ives, Charlie Rutledge, and enjoy.